afternoon and thanks for joining us for the sitting of the lower house. I'm Simone Absalom. The session will start with prayers followed by a roll call of those in attendance. This is usually followed by statements by ministers, questions and answers to questions, items on the government business and private members' motions. The lower house of Parliament is to begin debates today on public debt management. The bill entitled An Act to Amend the Public Debt Management Act will facilitate the provisions for better management of public debt and will repeal the Loan Act 1964 and several other enactments related to raising of loans by the government and for connected matters. Minister of Finance and Planning Audley Shaw is to pilot the Public Debt Management Bill. Minister of Justice Delroy Chuck will be the main speaker today as the House of Representatives continues with the annual sectoral debate. Minister Chuck is expected to respond to a number of questions facing his ministry, including the need to speed up the judicial process, as well as the process of drafting bills. Other speakers scheduled for the debates today are former Minister of Health and current opposition spokesman Dr. Fenton Ferguson and the opposition Member of Parliament for Westmoreland Eastern, Luther Buchanan. If you are planning to attend a session at Gordon House, here are some rules you need to keep in mind. No visitor shall create any act of disorder within the precincts of the House. No visitor shall be admitted to the House without first obtaining an admission card from the office of the clerk. Visitors who remain within the precincts of the House during a suspension of the session are asked to keep silent. No photography, videography, or sketching of the proceedings is allowed unless so authorized by a presiding officer. And there should be no smoking inside the parliamentary building. Now over to the proceedings.
Dr. Campbell, Mr. Campbell, Mr. Clark, Mrs. Cuthbert Flynn, Miss Daly, Mr. Daly, Mrs. Dalrymple Philibert, Dr. Davies, Mr. Fagan, Dr. Ferguson, Dr. Green, Dr. Guy, Miss Hannah, Mr. Hales, Mrs. Holness, Mr. Hilton, Dr. Campbell, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Kellier, Mr. Main, Dr. McNeil, Miss Nito, Mr. Paulwell, Mr. Michael Phillips, Dr. Phillips, Mr. Pickersgill, Mr. Redmond, Mr. Robertson, Mr. Robinson, Mrs. Simpson-Miller, Mr. Stewart, Mr. Terrelong, Reverend Thwaites, Mr. Dwayne Vaz, Mr. Wright.
Statements by ministers. Announcements.
Laid on the table of the House today are the following. Annual report of the e-Learning Jamaica Company Limited for the year 2013-2014. Annual reports of the Land Administration and Management Program LAMP Fund for the years 2007 and 2008-09.
So, Speaker, those matters that has been laid, sir. I'm not in position. Where are they? When they said electronically or no said CDs, nothing. The problem is that I don't have that. Those matters that have been laid. I don't find them.
Members, we have a number of visitors in the gallery. I wish us to welcome them as they stay with us in the presentation today. Thank you. Bills brought from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker, as a point of order, I just made a request to have the matters that were laid on the table. And you have not even responded, sir.
Member Fagan, you are requesting a copy or requesting that it should be distributed. My information is that after it is laid, we can let you have copies, but it is on the website and it has been electronically forwarded to all members.
It goes to their email addresses and then later
Mr. Fagan, you would like to have a copy. And I am advising you that it's now on the website, know that it has been laid in Parliament. And you can have a copy. Electronically, it will be transmitted to who want it. But as you will recall, it wasn't a parliamentary decision. However, we have not been distributing and making hundreds of copies of these matters, because they're all left on the desk. One or two members would have them.
Mr. Speaker, if I may intervene, you said that it was not the decision of the House. And if he wants a copy, he can get it, and it's on the website. If I recall, when I was on that site, I was insisting that when you say laid on the table of the House, a member should have a copy. It was said then, because of the cost to print so many copies, and the decision was that it would be sent electronically to members. But if I recall, it was said then that at least 5 copies, printed copies, will be made available. That if a member seeks to have one, then he could have, now that he's asking, that's what the decision was then, that at least 5 copies with printed copy would have been here. Because so once once you have a copy and the clerk has a copy, then it is laid on the table of the House, because those are the table they're talking about. And you say we would have at least 5 copies. That's what we said. But the rest, and if a member asks, then you would have gotten his printed copy. But at the same time, it is sent out electronically to all of us. So that was the decision that was taken then.
I must advise that if there is anybody who wants a copy and would like to have it, just advise me.
From that file, Mr. Speaker, can I have a copy?
We will get to you. Petitions, papers, reports from committees, Notices of motions given orally. Mr. Shaw. Questions and answers to questions. Mr. Bunting.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to draw your attention to the question notice paper. I've had a question from the 9th of March, awaiting of 2017. And you're right to ask, because I've been waiting 8 weeks on the answer. Not only have I not gotten the answer, but it's not even reflected on the other paper today. And it was question 1, and the answers have not been. It was delivered last week. No, but I had indicated I wanted an oral answer on these questions. I've neither received the answers, and it had indicated I wanted it orally.
Mr. Speaker,
Minister, let me disturb you. The leader of the opposition business would like to respond before you.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, sir, the gentleman indeed tabled some questions, and the member, the young gentleman, Central Manchester, last Tuesday, if my memory serves me right, those very questions were tabled, and the leader of opposition business was indicated to him, and I made myself available if and when the Honourable member from Central Manchester want to have follow-up questions, I would be available. So again, we are being accused.
You are showing the split.
We are again being accused. We are again being accused
Hear the minister. Proceed,
of
Minister.
not supplying information when the information was already supplied.
Could you just answer the questions now? And I have a follow-up question. I still haven't seen the answers. I have not received the answers. Yeah?
Mr. Bunting. Could you just have a seat? I am sure that the leader of opposition business would like to.
No, Mr. Speaker, it is true that the questions were tabled last week. Sorry, the answers. I don't think I got a copy. But with the clear understanding that when the member is ready, anytime he's ready, the follow-up will be done.
Mr. Speaker, I am available today for supplementary questions. I am available today for supplementary. Well, that is not, Mr. I did what I had to do. I tabled them. He was elected by the good people of Central Manchester to be present in the House.
Mr. Speaker, with respect, I was present for every sitting for 8 weeks, 5 weeks of which they were overdue. And the minister stalled, and he hid like a coward and answered the one day I was missing. That's beneath him. That is beneath him. That is beneath him. That's the behavior becoming of a coward.
No, Mr. Speaker, I will not allow the young member from Central Manchester to. You heard his last remarks, a very unparliamentary language he used, unbecoming and behavior of a coward. I'm going to ask that he withdraws that, sir.
Mr. Bunting, you asked some questions in the House, and those questions were answered and were documented and presented. The leader of... Mr. Bunting, I'm speaking. Please, have a seat. the Leader of Opposition Business advised this House that you were absent, and that if when you arrive, you wanted to go to the questions and ask supplementary answers, and this House agrees. The answers probably were not given to you. You now have them. If you wish to go through them and ask supplementary questions at another time or now, you may do so.
Well, Mr. Speaker, given that these were tabled on Tuesday and I was in Parliament on Wednesday, neither the clerk or the minister shared a copy of these answers with me. I would appreciate some time, since as you can see it's a very voluminous set of answers, to go through them and then ask follow-up questions to the minister.
Mr. Bunting, I will not agree with you to place the blame on either the Speaker or the Clerk. Your Leader of Opposition, on your behalf, asked this House to make the Minister available when you come in to go through the answers and ask supplementary. We did what we needed to do. So if you did not hear, if you were not told, we are now telling you, you now have a copy of the answers in your hand. If you would like to go through them and come tomorrow or another time, the House will be available for you to ask your supplementary questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I will ask the supplementary questions tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Speaker, I raised the point where the Honourable member from Central Manchester used some unparliamentary language. And I'm going to again insist that he withdraws.
Mr. Bunting. Oh, Mr. Bunting, it is parliamentary, it's honourable in Parliament. If you make a statement like you did, simply just withdraw.
What are you, I'm not certain what you're asking me to withdraw, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Order, please. Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. Motions relating to the sittings of the House. Motions for leave to introduce bills. Presentation of bills without leave of the House first obtained. Public business. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this afternoon under public business, the Minister of Finance and the Public Service will open item number 4, I think, on the order paper, bill entitled an act to amend the Public Debt Management Act to be debated. We will open this afternoon and continue the debate tomorrow afternoon. Under sectoral debate, Mr. Speaker, we lead with the member from St. Andrew Southeast, Northeast, and then we will go to the member from St. Thomas Eastern, the MP, and we'll close under the sectoral debate the member from Westmoreland Eastern. But we'll start, as I said, sir, with the Minister of Finance and the Public Service opening the debate.
Mr. Chuck. Mr. Shaw.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, by way of a background, the Public Debt Management Act, PDMA, of 2012 was enacted on December 24, 2012, and came into operation in January 2013. The PDMA represents a coherent and comprehensive legislative framework and takes a strategic approach to public debt management. Section 25 of the Act makes provisions for changes to be effected to the Act by conferring wide regulations, making powers to the Minister pertaining to the issuing and management of the public debt and granting of guarantees. Mr. Speaker, it has been recognized that for operational efficiency and effectiveness of debt management, it has become necessary to effect changes to the Act in line with international best practices. The PDMA, while providing a framework for the overall management of the public debt, does not address the operational aspects of debt management. The proposed amendments will therefore seek to be more detailed, specific, and be more flexible while still remaining consistent with the Act, thereby conferring better outcomes to the provisions of the Act. Mr. Speaker, the amendments will provide guidelines regarding the main roles, functions, and responsibilities of the operational bodies governed under the Act. And to that end, the functions of the debt committees as created in the Act will be articulated. The amendments will also provide a full description of the detailed functions of the 4 operational units of the debt management branch of the Ministry of Finance. Mr. Speaker, let me give a brief overview of the amendment. Section 2, under the interpretation clause, is amended with a concise definition of the terms contingent liabilities and explicit contingent liabilities, which are referred to in the Act but not defined. These definitions are now included. Additionally, definitions of certain risks to which the debt portfolio is exposed, including credit, market, interest rates, liquidity, refinancing, and operational risks, are now included in the Act. The term derivative transaction is also defined. In Section 3, Mr. Speaker, it is amended to rank as pari passu all government liabilities in the form of public debt and all obligations under guarantees authorized under the Act. To ensure applicability of the provisions of Section 21 to all government liabilities, this section is being moved from the subheading of the Act that addresses government guarantees to Section 27, which applies universally to all government liabilities. Under Section 4A, subsection A, in order to, Mr. Speaker, to maintain consistency with other related acts such as Section 48D of the Financial Administration and Audit Act, Section 4, subsection A of the Act is being amended by adding the words, while keeping risks at prudent and acceptable levels, following the phrase, at the lowest cost. Mr. Speaker, domestic market developments are addressed under Sections 4B and 4D of the original Act. The interrelated activities in respect of domestic market development outlined in these sections have been combined into one, thereby creating a single clause 4B on the subject that is more compact and comprehensive. Mr. Speaker, Sections 4C and E of the original Act require that the debt is managed consistent with fiscal sustainability and that the medium-term debt management strategy is compatible with the targets of the macroeconomic objectives of the government, respectively. Given that both sections address the same discipline they are being combined into one Section 4C. Additionally, a new Section 4A has been inserted, making provision for the Bank of Jamaica to be appointed as fiscal agent in keeping with a signed fiscal agent agreement. In Section 6, Mr. Speaker, subject to the amendments to Section 4 and existing Section 5 of the original Act, a new Section 6A has been incorporated regarding the establishment of limits to control inherent risks to the portfolio: credit, market, interest rate, liquidity, refinancing, and operational risks. Section 7, Mr. Speaker, subsections 1 and 2 are being amended to establish a body called the Public Debt Management Committee, and also to detail its functions with respect to medium-term public debt management. In Section 8, subsection 1 of the Act establishes a debt financing committee. However, the frequency of the meeting of the committee is not specified by the Act. An amendment is made to specify the frequency of the meetings of the committee by including the words "which is to meet at least quarterly" in Part 2 of the second schedule. Also, Sections 8C and 8F will be combined into one and include reference to the annual borrowing plan of the Ministry of Finance and extension the Government of Jamaica. In Section 10, Mr. Speaker, the purposes for which loans may be raised are detailed in Section 10 of the Act. In keeping with prudent debt management practices, the section is to be amended to include raising funding for the purpose of executing liability management transactions which will facilitate cost savings and positively reprofile the debt, among other things. In Section 11, Mr. Speaker, subsection 2 of the Act, it is amended by deleting the words "or for any related purposes" is to be made. The rationale for this is that there has been varied interpretation of the section, and we have therefore to prevent ambiguity the issuance of an instrument by the Minister authorizing named accountable officers, Financial Secretary, Deputy Financial Secretary, and the head of the Debt Management Branch to sign documents or agreements that are ancillary to a principal agreement. Under Section 21, Mr. Speaker, there are no provisions in the PDMA Act for the assumption of debt of public bodies by the government. Although the government is called upon from time to time to assume the non-guaranteed debt of public bodies due to various situations, including divestment and dissolution, among others. In the absence of such provisions, the alternative is to assume the debt under Section 10F, which requires the approval of Parliament. Accordingly, it is necessary to amend the Act to specifically stipulate and establish the requirements and operations to be put in place in the event of the assumption of debt of public bodies. So, Mr. Speaker, in this vein, Section 21 is to be repealed and replaced to reflect payment by government of non-guaranteed debt incurred by a public body. In Section 22, Mr. Speaker, of the Act, it stipulates that an annual report on the management of the public debt during the preceding financial year is to be tabled in the House of Representatives along with the financial statements and revenue estimates. Amendments to the Financial Administration and Audit Act in March 2014 adopted enhanced fiscal rules which established a budget calendar to allow for passage of the budget prior to the start of the fiscal year, effective fiscal year 2015-2016. The PDMA Act details the information to be contained in the annual report, which includes end of fiscal year information that would not be available prior to the end of the year. To this end, an amendment is being made to the Act to facilitate the tabling of the annual report after the end of the fiscal year, since we wanted to include the fiscal year. In the second schedule, Mr. Speaker, consistent with the approach taken in modern public debt management offices, the Debt Management Branch, DMB, has been organized along the functional lines of front, or the Portfolio Management Office, middle, or the Debt Strategy and Analysis Office, back offices, or the Debt Operations Office, and the Compliance Office. The amendment to the second schedule details the guidelines regarding the main roles, functions, and responsibilities of each of the operational units of the Debt Management Branch. Each operating unit shall be responsible for the functions set out in these amendments and shall, for the purposes of operational control, establish and update formal procedures, manuals defining the processes by which these functions are achieved. Mr. Speaker, finally, I want to mention that following a review of the Bank of Jamaica Act and the definitions of government securities in this Act, the Debt Management Act, Section 2, it was noted that there is no provision for the raising of loans and any other debt. Section 38 of the Bank of Jamaica Act is being therefore amended by inserting immediately after the words the payment of interest and principal in respect of the words loans and other debt instruments. So, Mr. Speaker, these are the amendments on the table and which, Mr. Speaker, are, I should say, non-controversial because they in fact had started being prepared from the previous administration, and it is consistent with better management of our portfolio of debt, which, as you know, is heading in the right direction. It had gone to close to 150% debt to GDP ratio. We are now down to close to 120%, and we are heading to 96% debt to GDP by 2020, and we target to end to a 60% debt to GDP ratio by 2025. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, as indicated, we suspend the debate until tomorrow afternoon when the opposition will make their presentation. We now move straight into the sectoral debate, beginning with the member from Northeast, St. Andrew.
The question that the debate be suspended until tomorrow. Those in favour? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it.
I know, man.
Delroy Chuck. Order, please. Order.
Mr. Speaker, permission to speak from a place other than my home. Mr. Speaker, it is an extraordinary privilege for me to represent the people of the great constituency of Northeast St. Andrew in this Honourable House for the 5th time. Mr. Speaker, I'm now in my 20th year, and I'd like to thank the voters of Northeast St. Andrew. They are represented here by just a few of the delegates, because if I made an open invitation, Mr. Speaker, then the whole of Parliament will be crowded. So I selected a few to be here. And for the record, Mr. Speaker, we always win by over 60%, sometimes as high as 68%, 2-1. So we don't need the voters here. They know I'm working hard in my constituency. Mr. Speaker, to the Prime Minister, the Most Honourable Andrew Holness, for the faith in me to lead the Ministry of Justice. My gratitude, Mr. Speaker, to the attorneys of the Ministry of Justice, the Attorney General and the Solicitor General and their staff, the Permanent Secretary who is sitting in the way, Mrs. Carl Palmer, the management and staff of the Ministry of Justice, for the hard work and dedication to the ministry and to the people of Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, to donor partners for their sustained support to the reform program, the Canadian government, the European Union, the US Embassy, the British High Commission, different arms of the United Nations, and the Inter-American Development Bank. I applaud the PIOJ and the partnership of CSG, Citizen Security and Justice Program, and the National Integrity Action. Mr. Speaker, to the judiciary for their sterling contribution to the preservation of justice, the Chief Justice and the judges of the Supreme Court, the President and other members of the Court of Appeal, the parish judges and the lay magistrates. My thanks also, Mr. Speaker, to the Director of Public Prosecutions and her staff, the Administrator General and her staff, and to all the supporting personnel and agencies of the Ministry of Justice. Mr. Speaker, finally but not last, and by no means least, to my family for the personal sacrifices they make as I pursue this time-consuming work of representational politics and my work as Cabinet Minister. My wife of 39 years, Mr. Speaker, is sitting in the dock. Next year we celebrate our 40th anniversary. And sitting beside her, my youngest daughter, who has followed in my footsteps and has taken over my law practice. And with her, with my eldest daughter, every now and then, I get some pocket money. Mr. Speaker, I also thank my close protection officer, Lance and Howard, for providing faithful service since I've been Minister of Government and continue to give me full support. And Mr. Speaker, to the staff of Parliament, to yourself, Mr. Speaker, for the distinctive way that you have dealt with this Parliament. And we certainly admire the strong and bold action you occasionally have to take. And certainly, Mr. Speaker, to the Almighty God for blessing me and protecting me over the decades. Mr. Speaker, there's an urgent demand to fix the court system, which admittedly is dysfunctional. If justice delayed is justice denied, then my God, we're really dysfunctional because the system is not delivering in a timely manner. Mr. Speaker, this urgent need to fix the court system, which, as I indicate, is dysfunctional. Mr. Speaker, when the court is not functioning, then things go awry in the society. And so, Mr. Speaker, the imperative of a well-functioning court system is impatient of debate. It prevents chaos and anarchy, provides confidence in the dispensation of justice, contributes to economic growth and development, improves and consolidates trust between the government and the governed, and is the most effective deterrent to crime and violence. In truth, Mr. Speaker, I agree. Without justice, there can be no peace. The state, Mr. Speaker, has an indispensable responsibility to provide an enabling environment and support for an open, responsive, and efficient justice system. That responsibility involves financial, material, personnel, policy, and legislative support. And this government, Mr. Speaker, more than ever, also has a responsibility to engage the citizens in the shaping of a new era of justice. Mr. Speaker, there must be a vision for justice. And our vision for justice is for Jamaica to have a modern, people-focused justice system that engenders trust and confidence. This means, Mr. Speaker, trust and confidence by all, not just a few. We want a justice system that is accessible to all and easily accessible, Mr. Speaker. We want a justice system that is accountable, reliable, and trusted. We want and must have a justice system that secures, safeguards, and protects the fundamental rights and freedoms of all Jamaicans and delivers justice in a reasonable time. In a nutshell, Mr. Speaker, we need a justice system that works for all our citizens, the business and commercial sectors, and for the wider international community. Mr. Speaker, let me remind this Honourable House that justice has been the most neglected sector in this country for decades. We get less than 2% of the budget. In a society crying out for peace, security, and justice, more resources and support must be provided to the courts and to the justice sector. And this minister will do all in his power to seek and obtain greater allocation to the justice system. But, Mr. Speaker, even while we wait for additional resources, which will come, we must make reform program. Some things, Mr. Speaker, must transcend the boundaries of partisan discourse. And the achievement of justice for all the people of Jamaica must qualify as one of those areas that defy the narrowness of partisan considerations. And the people of Jamaica that we have delivered on a great number of these commitments as we try to modernize the justice sector. We made some very specific commitments to the people. These are: 1, re-energize the justice reform program; 2, institute a program to remove and repeal outdated legislation; 3, start the process to reduce criminal and civil case backlogs; 4, strengthen the independence and capacity of the judiciary and prosecutorial service; 5, modernize and maintain the courts; 6, provide more court spaces; 7, protect vulnerable groups; 8, establish a human rights commission. After 1 year, Mr. Speaker, I present my report card to the people of Jamaica. This government, Mr. Speaker, has continued the holistic and far-reaching reform of the justice sector. We have started a national movement on the ground with key stakeholders, getting them on board and involved in the justice reform program. More than 2,700 community leaders, including justices of the peace, leaders in our communities, and other outstanding citizens, such as teachers and pastors, have been sensitized on the justice services and engaged in a constructive way to contribute to the reform program. Since January of this year, Mr. Speaker, some 2,400 JPs have been exposed to information in a number of areas in which they provide advice and act in the normal course of their duties. The focus on JPs especially, Mr. Speaker, is intended to strengthen the capacity of the justice system to function in a more facilitative manner in quasi-judicial settings. The message, Mr. Speaker, is reaching the nooks and crannies of Jamaica. 439 JPs were commissioned during the last fiscal year. So far, Mr. Speaker, in this fiscal year, 486 new applications for JPs have been received. I am on record, Mr. Speaker, of saying that the JP citizen ratio should be in a region of 1 to 100. If that applies, we should have about 20,000. At the moment, we have under 8,000. And Mr. Speaker, we need to put these JPs in the underserved rural communities, inner cities, and in many of the parishes. And Mr. Speaker, I'm aware that a number of MPs would like to serve as Justice of the Peace. I'm in touch with the custodies. The custodies feel, in a way, Mr. Speaker, that everyone should go through the 18 hours of training. I'm trying to convince them that members of Parliament, as legislators, really should have a shortened version of this training. The training itself, Mr. Speaker, is a good training. And really, you know, when JPs who are being commissioned do it, they're very happy with it. But shortly, Mr. Speaker, I think I will try to convince the custodies that members of Parliament who would like to serve as JPs should be given a shortened training and then be commissioned as Justice of the Peace. Mr. Speaker, during the year, 509 JPs benefited from qualifying training, and an additional 49 were trained in mediation and 140 in restorative justice practices. Mr. Speaker, the trending discussion recently has been the outdated fines which certain breaches attract. Mr. Speaker, there is a program that is being executed by the Legal Reform Department to review all the laws of Jamaica, at least 600 pieces of legislation to bring the penalties up to date, and the process has started and will be fast-tracked, Mr. Speaker. Many of these laws have never been changed. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, some of these laws have imperial measures. Those of you who don't know what imperial measures is, British pounds and feet and yards. And we should be going now to dollars and cents and meters and centimeters. You still see in these laws feet and acres instead of hectares. Well, Mr. Speaker, I warn this Honourable House that in due course we may have to work 3 days per week to update the laws of the country. Mr. Speaker, we have started the work in earnest to reduce the backlog of cases in our civil and criminal courts. The Chief Justice has instituted a statistical case management system that identifies backlog and to deal with the backlog. Amazingly, Mr. Speaker, the Chief Justice is trying to deal with all cases over 5 years because the backlog is seen as 5 years, and to try to deal with those cases as soon as possible. But, Mr. Speaker, we have to act more expeditiously, and I certainly would like, by 2020, to reduce the backlog to those cases which are over 2 years, but certainly not longer than 3 years. So, Mr. Speaker, we hope that the backlog, when we speak of backlog, it will be those cases that are not in the courts longer than 3 years. Mr. Speaker, we are engaging more judges and have sought the support of the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service to engage part-time judges. To do so, Mr. Speaker, require constitutional changes that have recently been approved by Cabinet, and the appropriate legislation will come to this House shortly. Mr. Speaker, arrangements are in place to provide more court spaces, but we hope to have further discussion to have additional court personnel to upgrade and to also to upgrade the current post. But, Mr. Speaker, the government does not have unlimited resources to allocate to the justice sector. Every ministry needs more. I accept that the appropriate allocation to the justice sector will not come overnight. In the meantime, there's need to reduce the demand on the system. The current level of demand is unsustainable, even with additional resources. Other means and ways to settle disputes must be tried and encouraged. Long before they become court cases, or even when they're in the courts. Alternative paths, Mr. Speaker, to resolve and dispose of existing court cases must be strengthened and more extensively relied on. Mr. Speaker, support has been given to the Chief Justice and more support is forthcoming. Mr. Speaker, especially in low-hanging fruits, probates, divorces. These are matters which can be dealt with by simply checking the papers. They don't have to go into open court. And I see no reason, Mr. Speaker, why these cases cannot be dealt with within 3 months, maximum 6 months. And Mr. Speaker, I'm in discussion with the Chief Justice with a view to providing additional personnel so that divorces and probate can be dealt with in a timely manner. But, Mr. Speaker, we need to divert more cases from the traditional court system using restorative justice, child diversion, mediation, and arbitration. This approach, Mr. Speaker, has been tried in many other jurisdictions. In Canada, because of the overwhelming number of cases and the fact that many persons do not want to sit on the bench in Canada, they have used mediation, alternative dispute resolution to complement the court system extensively. We are using it here, Mr. Speaker, but it is not being used sufficiently. And even though 40% of the cases in the civil courts are settled, we need to ramp that up to more like 60 or 70%, so they are settled, so that less than 30% of the cases are actually tried. And in that way, Mr. Speaker, they can be dealt with expeditiously. Mr. Speaker, just recently, we passed the Plea Negotiation and Agreement Act. This, Mr. Speaker, we passed in the lower house here, and it will go to the Senate shortly. And I'm hoping, Mr. Speaker, that it not only will be passed shortly, but I say, Mr. Speaker, I will go into overdrive campaign mode as we seek to promote reconciliation, mercy, forgiveness, and rehabilitation in our criminal justice system. Mr. Speaker, restorative justice and child diversion are important parts of the justice system. Restorative justice is in place, and shortly the Child Diversion Act will be brought here. Mr. Speaker, we have some special guests in the House this afternoon. They are from Tower Hill Restorative Justice Center. Mr. Speaker, these community leaders, pastors, teachers, neighbors are living the restorative justice dream and turning around their community, utilizing compromise, not conflict, embracing forgiveness and choosing love. Here's what some have to say, Mr. Speaker. Claudette, I found peace again in my family. Davina, we learned how to let go of pain. Marilyn, justice is here. I applaud the community of Tower Hill, Mr. Speaker, and the leaders who are here this afternoon with the Restorative Justice Center Manager, Roydon Hall. Restorative justice, Mr. Speaker, works. Restorative justice eases the pain while healing troubled lives, restoring relations, and bringing peace within families, neighborhoods, and communities. That is why, Mr. Speaker, we are rolling out the alternative resolution infrastructure to give our people hope and communities a chance to dream again. That is why, Mr. Speaker, we are supporting and increasing the number of restorative justice centers across the island. 2 new restorative justice centers will open in Tivoli and Denham Town shortly. Mr. Speaker, we are establishing 14 parish justice centers that will have responsibility for the coordination of alternative dispute resolution processes in the parish. Restorative justice, child diversion, and other alternative dispute resolution related services will be available at these justice centers. We expect, Mr. Speaker, that a significant number of the cases that would normally be resolved in the traditional court system will be diverted to these justice centers. Members of the public who have the need for legal aid can go to these parish centers and have access to legal advice with one phone call. The first parish justice center, Mr. Speaker, will be opened in St. Anne in July. The St. Mary Parish Justice Center will be opened in August. We expect that Portland Parish Justice Center, which is to be located in the Buff Bay Courthouse, to be opened by October. Others will follow soon after, Mr. Speaker, and completed in this fiscal year. Mr. Speaker, the parish justice centers will be the hub of alternative dispute resolution mechanisms and justice services and support. Mr. Speaker, these parish centers will be iconic. They must stand out in the parish because from these justice centers, justice will emanate. We hope that these justice centers, Mr. Speaker, from wherever they are in the parish, will be the focal point to spread restorative justice, to allow for mediation, to engage with citizens to resolve their disputes, to reduce conflicts. And these justice centers, Mr. Speaker, will be the basis on which we start to reduce the backlog in the courts, because from these parish centers, we hope less disputes and conflicts will actually go to the court. Mr. Speaker, we have promised to repair and maintain the courthouses. We have spent more than $192 million to repair, maintain, construct, and improve court facilities for the last fiscal year. Mr. Speaker, we have spent over $20 million to upgrade the various air conditioning units, and we are spending money to outfit a number of these courts. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, we have undertaken works on Justice Square Public Building. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, a whole host of courts have been maintained, and shortly when you get the booklet, you will see the numerous courts that have been maintained and repaired and upgraded. But I'm watching the time, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have also completed the relocation of the ministry to the Constant Spring Complex. Lovely complex, Mr. Speaker, which all the members are invited to visit me at various times, especially this afternoon, where we can have our favorite drink. Mr. Speaker, the construction of the Family Court Attendance Center in Kingston will be built using the containerized concept. The Coroner's Court on Maxwell Avenue will shortly be completed and open to the public. The expansion of the Court of Appeal should start shortly and be completed in this fiscal year to provide for a third appeal court and enough chambers to accommodate 12 appeal court judges. The expansion of the traffic courts is expected to begin once the MOU for the lease has been finalized with the owners of the property. Mr. Speaker, we are changing the face of justice one court at a time. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, we hope to renovate 78 courtrooms in 19 court buildings and put in them audiovisual equipment, which is funded by the EU, Mr. Speaker. So far, we should have 21 fixed units and 22 mobile units. 2 of these units have already been installed in the Kingston and St. Andrew Parish Court, funded by the government of Jamaica, and the Supreme Court one was funded by the United States Embassy. 1 mobile unit is being used, Mr. Speaker, and Jamaica was recently commended by the United States following the use of the unit for live link testimony, the first international use under the Evidence Special Measures Act, and it was a success, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have experienced some delays, but we expect in the second quarter of this year, the equipment will arrive for us to be able to install them. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica has always prided itself on respecting and maintaining the independence and integrity of the judiciary as provided for by the Constitution. This government has absolutely no intention of trespassing on the independence which we recognize to be fundamental to the dispensation of justice and the preservation of our democracy. Let me say, Mr. Speaker, this minister, neither in my capacity as a practicing attorney for more than 34 years, nor as a minister of government, has ever or will ever interfere with the independence of the judiciary. I have done everything in my power, Mr. Speaker, to address the concerns of the judiciary. But everyone, including the judiciary, must see the link between problems in the society, economic growth, and the performance of the court system. Mr. Speaker, when I urge and I speak publicly that judges should do what their names imply, judge. It's not fair, Mr. Speaker, that when litigants wait for 2, 5, 8 years and more years, and they finally have their case heard in court, they have to wait another year, another 2 years. Mr. Speaker, with due respect, we have to ask our judges to please, once the case has been heard, try to deliver the judgment within a reasonable time. Mr. Speaker, there are people who say that I'm interfering with the judges by asking that. Certainly, Mr. Speaker, if I can't urge the judges to please deliver your judgment after it has been heard, it is just not fair to the litigants who haven't waited for the trial, now have to wait extended period of time for the delivery of the judgment. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, one case, poker, having to do with lawyers, whether or not they should come within the Poker Act passed in this House. 2 years have passed. And they gave last week a decision that the judgment would be delivered this week. Still the judgment is not delivered. Mr. Speaker, it cannot be right. It just cannot be right. And I know you know, Mr. Speaker, that there are many persons in the community and persons who should know better believe that I am in charge of the judiciary and I am in charge of the justice, everything that happens in the courts. Mr. Speaker, kill that lie. It's not true. I have no overriding power over judges or what happens in the courts. And to the extent that the ministry, Mr. Speaker, is responsible to ensuring that the facilities are in a decent, attractive, habilitated, a manner where people can feel proud to be, then yes, Mr. Speaker, the Ministry of Justice is responsible. But when people write me letters and make calls to me and ask me to talk to a judge, I can't do that. It would be interfering, and that is where you would be interfering in the independence of the judiciary. Mr. Speaker, our people must recognize that not even the Chief Justice or another judge can tell a judge what is to be done in a case. Any judge, including the Chief Justice, that attempts that will be perverting the course of justice. So this minister respects and knows his boundaries. But having said that, Mr. Speaker, all the stakeholders, including the judges, must step up to the plate and deliver, make sure the courts function effectively, and also that judgments are delivered. My wife, Mr. Speaker, has been serving as a juror for the last couple of weeks. And in fact, she's here because she was not empaneled yesterday. But she tells me, when you go to court, the jurors are frustrated. They go to court the last case on Monday is a case from 2008. And it can't start. Nobody remembers anything. You can't present her. But you see, Mr. Speaker, the point is, that when you go to the courthouses, and quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, there's absolutely no doubt that better must be done. Now, Mr. Speaker, 2 weeks ago, the Independent Commission for the Judiciary report was presented in this House, and Cabinet had the opportunity to consider the report, and Cabinet has made certain decisions which will be known in due course. But what I can say, Mr. Speaker, is that Cabinet recognized the importance of the judges, that they should be paid a good salary. Well, Mr. Speaker, within the constraints of an IMF agreement, we just cannot give the judges what they're really worth. But we are doing our best, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that they get what is possible. Mr. Speaker, for the ministry's part, the judges, when I met with them, they needed motor cars. Some judges were appointed without motor cars. Some judges were in need of new cars. Well, I'm happy to report, Mr. Speaker, that we provided 21 new vehicles for the judges. And so the ministry, Permanent Secretary and myself have discharged our burden to the judges. Every single judge, no one of them can complain now that they don't have a new car or a car that is functioning. And if the new judges are appointed, we will find the resources to buy them the new car to which they are entitled. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, we are doing everything in our powers to assist the judges. The last administration provided 10 judicial clerks. Last summer, the ministry gave assistance for 36 additional judicial clerks to work with the judges in the summer to assist in the delivery of justice, especially of the judgments. And Mr. Speaker, in the prosecutorial service, we have taken steps to increase the number of members in the DPP. 17 new members of staff will be appointed in this fiscal year, and the unification of the prosecutorial service is being actively pursued, and we expect legislation to come to Parliament soon, where members, at the moment, the DPP is only in charge of Crown Counsels in their office. The vision is that you should have a prosecutorial service, so the 70 or more clerk of the courts in the parishes should come within the jurisdiction of the DPP, be able to interact with the DPP, to be trained by the DPP, so when they're out in the parishes prosecuting, they really have the experience and the ability to stand up to senior lawyers, and not just being out there in the country areas, in the parish courts, without the experience of having had some experience in the Supreme Court or the Circuit Court. So we intend to have one prosecutorial service. Mr. Speaker, as a government, we have an indispensable role to protect the weak, the voiceless, and the vulnerable in our society. During the last fiscal year, more than 2,226 matters were settled through legal aid services and 3,030 by duty counsel, compared to 1,618 and 2,216 in 2015-2016. 120 mentally challenged clients benefited from representation from legal aid. Mr. Speaker, the mobile legal aid unit has been a fantastic success. Since they were commissioned in January of this year, they have been to many communities and have seen 450 persons benefiting from their service. The Legal Aid Council has been able to empanel 658 attorneys. And the unit, Mr. Speaker, has visited several communities. Today, they're in Kencott. Sunday, they were in Canterbury. They will go into the communities of Almond Town, Anchovy in St. James, Majesty Gardens, Brownstown, Franklin Town in your constituency, Eastern Kingston, in Turners, Clarendon, Marchbank, St. Catherine. And every week, Mr. Speaker, 2 or 3 communities are visited by the legal aid unit. So, Mr. Speaker, no one will be left behind. Everyone will be eligible for legal aid advice and service. Mr. Speaker, the Administrator General's Department closed 678 cases, including 479 backlog cases during the fiscal year. The department continued prudent management of funds, with the common fund reaching $2.341 billion under management. More than $550 million was paid out to beneficiaries during the last fiscal year, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are changing the face of justice in this country, one person at a time, one family at a time, one community at a time. Mr. Speaker, victims of crime can get not only a small amount of compensation, very little available, but they are given counseling and support after an incident. And 5,933 new clients, Mr. Speaker, were seen during the course of last year. Mr. Speaker, 1,831 children benefited from the Children in Court project. And at the West Kingston Satellite Counseling Center, 409 new clients benefited. Mr. Speaker, what we want to do is to ensure that victims of crime, that they participate in the process. And recently, legislation was passed at Legislation Committee, which will come into Parliament shortly, where in a criminal trial, a judge, having found an accused guilty, will be able to award compensation to the victim. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, in the plea bargain bill, plea negotiations and agreement bill, we have made it one of the possibilities for accused persons to offer compensation, and that will be taken into consideration when he pleads guilty in terms of what sentence would be imposed. Mr. Speaker, the new face of justice is about helping individuals, families and communities heal, recover and prosper. Mr. Speaker, shortly we will be bringing to Parliament a report and projection to set up the National Human Rights Commission, which we hope will be headed by the Public Defender. And this commission, Mr. Speaker, will ensure that human rights, the constitutional rights of our people, and other human rights, that they are properly and effectively protected. Mr. Speaker, the legislative program has been doing extremely well. We passed the Arbitration Act, the Jury Act, Law Reform, Restorative Justice Act. The Plea Integrity Commission bill was passed here, Mr. Speaker, and we hope the Senate will be able to pass it shortly. The Plea Negotiations Agreements Act was passed here recently, Mr. Speaker, and should move up to the Senate very soon. Mr. Speaker, at the Commission for the Prevention of Corruption, 19,000 persons filed their declaration, a record since 2002. Mr. Speaker, in one fiscal year, we have done more to change the face of justice than has been done in decades. We have pushed justice services closer to the ground. With the establishment of the Western Civil Registry for the Supreme Court by the previous administration, there is no need to establish a civil court in that part of the island based on the workload. We will facilitate the establishment of the court in this fiscal year, Mr. Speaker. We are strengthening the infrastructure and alternative dispute resolution mechanism with policy and legislative provisions for restorative justice and child diversions. Mr. Speaker, we are expanding court spaces. We are also increasing the number of JPs. We are strengthening the prosecutorial services. We are implementing alternative dispute resolution. We are improving accountability and transparency in the justice system. Mr. Speaker, we have moved the justice system forward over the last year but there's a lot more work to be done to address decades of neglect. We will continue with the reform of justice program, Mr. Speaker, with support from our partners. The JUST program will continue to strengthen the judiciary through training, development of manuals, and improvements to the systems. The Justice, Security, Accountability, and Transparency project will advance the work that has been started to install the new technologies in the courts and to contribute to the timely disposal of cases and improve witness protection. The forward agenda for justice reform, Mr. Speaker, is expected to cost $7 billion to be completed by 2020. This does not include the cost for infrastructural works and institutional capacity. I am confident, Mr. Speaker, that the people of Jamaica will see a seismic shift in the justice system. Mr. Speaker, we will put the alternative dispute resolution infrastructure across 1,000 schools in Jamaica. Many persons do not understand how important alternative dispute is, but we want to put it in all the schools. We will establish, Mr. Speaker, these 14 parish justice centers, and we hope to utilize public spaces, because in these public spaces, Mr. Speaker, we will be saving costs because we would not have to rent anywhere. Mr. Speaker, already the face of justice has changed. People are getting excited and involved in the justice system. More JPs are being trained and available to provide a better quality of service to their communities and to the court system. This year's budget, Mr. Speaker, will allow us to provide some support to the offices of the custodies, once again demonstrating our commitment to strengthening the capability of the justice system to respond to the needs of the justice sector. As we continue to change the face of justice, and with God's help and all the people of Jamaica, we can make justice a priority in the governance of our country. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank the Minister for a very informative and disciplined in how it's presented to the House. And we now move on to the second speaker, the member from St. Thomas Eastern.
Dr. Fenton Ferguson.
Mr. Speaker, I ask to speak from seek permission to speak from a seat other than my own.
Please. Go ahead, Mr. Fenton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, colleague parliamentarians on both sides of this Honourable House, I rise this afternoon to continue the opposition's contribution to this sectoral debate. In doing so, let me first bring you greetings from my family and the constituents of Eastern St. Thomas. Today's presentation will be my second in this capacity, and I reiterate what I had stated from day one, that the awesome responsibility and reach of this portfolio must never be undervalued because of its contribution to economic growth, social harmony, and protection of the most vulnerable members of our society. And in a moment, I will provide the evidence of that. Permit me, therefore, at the outset, to specially greet all who are viewing or listening on television, radio, or smart device, and especially Mr. Speaker, and the Parliament will be beneficiaries of his vast experience and knowledge of the political process in furtherance of the best traditions of democracy. Mr. Speaker, although the House will at the appropriate time allow for fulsome commendation to the member from St. Andrews Southwest and the immediate past president of the PMP and leader of the parliamentary opposition, the Most Honourable Portia Simpson Miller, I cannot allow this opportunity to pass without registering my gratitude and that of my constituency for the sterling service to party, parliament, and the people of Jamaica for over 40 years. Mr. Speaker, I will be speaking on a number of topics, namely the Occupational Safety and Health Act, Work Permit Overseas Program, Minimum Wage, and others. In relation to my constituency, Mr. Speaker, I want to offer thanks to Almighty God for the faith and trust of the people of St. Thomas Eastern. For the past 24 years, I've had the privilege of serving them as their representative to this Honourable House. Mr. Speaker, I will continue to make strident representation for improved welfare of the people of St. Thomas. The descendants of over 1,000 persons who were brutally repressed, hanged, shot, burned, eaten live by dogs, and tortured to death following the so-called Morant Bay uprising of 1865. Mr. Speaker, in that vein, I must faithfully carry a message they have given me for the Prime Minister and Minister of Economic Growth and Job Creation. And I quote, "Doc, tell the Prime Minister, please make sure that we, the people of St. Thomas, get the promised Southern Coastal Highway from Harbourview to Port Antonio. And Doc, tell him to make sure that we don't get no third-class road, because we are no third-class citizens out here. End of quote. Mr. Speaker, the member from Portland Western was reported as having said that major developments in Portland should positively impact adjoining St. Mary and St. Anne in land, sea, and air. Well, with the Southern Coastal Highway, those developments will positively impact all of St. Thomas and St. Thomas Eastern in particular. Mr. Speaker, good political representation cannot proceed without dependable political workers and a myriad of volunteers. So, Mr. Speaker, to my councillors, caretakers, polling division workers, foot soldiers, road runners, and the volunteers, I say many, many thanks. Mr. and the four others. Mr. Speaker, I offer my thanks to all concerned for the 225 houses provided free of cost for the sugar workers in Stokes Hall and Hampton Court, into which some have already occupied. The process began with groundbreaking with Prime Minister Simpson Miller. And Madam, I am not strong enough to carry the tons of praises and thanks that they have given to me to take to you. But that which I could carry today, I bring to you. Many thanks. Mr. Speaker, they have offered sincere thanks for the efforts of the member from St. James Southern and former Minister Derek Kelly, to the late Roger Clark, Minister, and the present Minister, Honourable Carl Samuda, who has done himself well in the short period. I didn't remember that, and I don't believe you. They didn't feel that. As well as to the European Union delegation and administrators. Mr. Speaker, it is beyond being called urgent that all the authorization letters and permits for security of tenure and necessary utilities and public amenities be provided forthwith, as there is nothing as petrifyingly offensive as a community without competent sewage, or that which breed crime, as hundreds of homes are cloaked in darkness. Mr. Speaker, like 2016 and previous years, the heavy rains which recently affected St. Thomas caused millions of dollars to property and infrastructural damage as well as injury, both in the western section and my own constituency. Occupational Safety and Health Act. Mr. Speaker, last year I made the following comments. Mr. Speaker, and I quote, "A recent incident in western Jamaica at an industrial site has raised into sharp relief the question of occupational safety and health. This is not a matter of appropriation of blame, which would be unworthy of this debate. Rather, it involves the question of moving with unified purpose towards the promulgation of this act." Mr. Speaker, I am happy that the minister heeded the advice and has tabled the bill, and Minister, I want to commend you. However, still to come is the debate, and I'm calling on you, Minister, to bring to bear the full weight of your office to ensure speedy passage of this act. Mr. Speaker, this bill has had a long gestation of over 20 years. but the House will agree that recent events at Cornwall Regional Hospital and the impact on the workers, and another at Rio Montego Bay, which had fatal results, have added urgency to this act. I wish once again to publicly offer condolences to the family of the deceased man and our sympathies to the injured, their relatives and colleagues. Mr. Speaker, this act will go a long way in preventing recurrence of this kind. Truth is, the twin questions of monitoring and enforcement of the provisions of the Act are of considerable moment. Mr. Speaker, the Act should be a significant increase in the number of designated places requiring monitoring and enforcement. Clearly, the complement of inspectors must be increased. And since there will be a wide distribution of such places requiring monitoring across the nation, I'm calling on the Prime Minister and Minister today to ensure that the process of recruitment and training of inspectors is carried out in an open and transparent manner. Work permit. The Daily Glean of April 23, 2013 carried a story headline, 1,644 work permits granted in 120 days. The article, Mr. Speaker, reported the NWU and the BITU as being upset at the high numbers which they said erode the ratio of national to foreign workers on any side. And the article reported the ministers defending the level of approvals. Mr. Speaker, I'm not about to question the integrity of the process now. What I question is the apparent lack of consultation with the workers' representatives, the union, and the stakeholders like the Master Builders Association. We on this side are for investment, local and foreign, but those investments must bring transfer of skills, new capital, clean environmental practices, and not to the detriment of our local labor force. All investments must adhere to the rules of Jamaican and international laws. The Overseas Work Program. Mr. Speaker, the Overseas Employment Program has endured the vicissitudes of decades of policy and change in administrations. However, it has built up for itself competitiveness and resilience that is enviable. And I wish to congratulate all, and especially the major players in this enterprise, the workers and their families, the employers and the administrators. Mr. Speaker, part of the reason for this edge is due entirely to the high caliber and work ethics of the Jamaican worker, as testified to by the overseas employers. And so, Mr. Speaker, I'm calling on the Minister to reintroduce the medicals for the United States overseas workers. It is a best practice which ensures that we retain the competitive edge among all foreign workers entering the United States and Canada. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, I made this call in my contribution to the 2016 debate, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, I also called on the Minister to continue to do medicals for all overseas work program because this represents best practice and in spite of the costs, gives Jamaica a competitive edge among workers from other countries and therefore is a worthwhile investment. Mr. Speaker, in my meetings with overseas employers, these calls were at the top of their agenda. End of quote. Mr. Speaker, I will continue this advocacy as there is need to maintain this position on behalf of the Jamaican workers. Mr. Speaker, while the United States is not hard and fast on the medicals being done, it is in our best interest to do them. Mr. Speaker, Of grave concern also for the overseas program is the possible passage of the bill for a cess on the transfer of funds from the United States to some 41 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, as proposed by Republican Congressman Mike Rogers of Alabama. Mr. Speaker, all attempts must be made at the diplomatic level and otherwise to avoid any possible fallout. Mr. Speaker, the opposition is also calling on the minister to ensure openness, transparency, and equity in the way the overseas program is administered. In recent past, several opposition members of parliament have expressed concerns in this regard. Minimum wage. Mr. Speaker, the printer's devil seemed to have been at work on the minister's presentation. Fact is that every reference to minimum wage seemed to have been studiously deleted. Mr. Speaker, minimum wage must be a part of the consideration of the sectoral debate.
Here, here. First.
Mr. Speaker, we do big up the workers who have held strain for almost a decade whilst we navigated the difficult waters of our multilateral agreements. Mr. Speaker, our workers made the ultimate sacrifice during the wage freeze and made guidelines agreements which were an important keystone to the success of the IMF agreement recently concluded. This sacrifice, Mr. Speaker, has pivoted our nation to the right side of the macroeconomic graph, laying a pathway to economic growth. Mr. Speaker, the country owes these workers under the leadership of their respective unions and the Jamaica Confederation of Trade Unions a huge debt of gratitude. Mr. Speaker, in 2016, this country was promised $18,000 per month and the doubling of the minimum wage for minimum wage earners under the rubric of prosperity. Mr. Speaker, although the $18,000 per month has yet to be fully materialized, the minimum wage earners deserve theirs. Mr. Speaker, though not often mentioned, this group is a vulnerable group. I, being cognizant of this fact, having announced a pending increase in the minimum wage, in January 2016 to be effective March 1st, 2016. Against the backdrop of this increase, Mr. Speaker, the now government promised this doubling of the minimum wage as a campaign promise. Mr. Speaker, the promised doubling would be welcomed by this cohort of workers in light of the almost $30 billion tax package they now face. Mr. Speaker, as a former minister, I'm aware that the Minimum Wage Commission would have to carry out consultations across the country for a minimum wage increase. But during the campaign, the country was given the impression that doubling of the minimum wage would have been by decree. Mr. Speaker, the opposition is calling on the minister to immediately put in place steps to lead to the increase in the minimum wage. And if there is a challenge, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance can show her how to phase it in. Phase it in. Similarly, Mr. Speaker, industrial security guards have been languishing in a significant way. And the reason for this humbug is the failure of these guards to be recognized as employees and not as independent contractors. This has put them in the position of not being able to be unionized no maternity leave, no entitlement to pension benefits, no paying of their statutory deductions, and in many instances, no entitlement to even a simple pay slip, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I did last year, I again joined the Minimum Wage Commission in calling for the reintroduction of the Joint Industrial Council to protect these 25,000 workers. Industrial security guards perform function, albeit in a private capacity, that complements the work of the security forces. Mr. Speaker, the government is the largest employer of private security guards. It would be a travesty, Mr. Speaker, that the same government that has passed laws in Parliament to protect the workers would engage in a group of workers whose rights are being infringed upon. Mr. Speaker, after many long hours of work, some of these security guards often carry home less than minimum wage and have no one to speak to or no one to speak for them. Mr. Speaker, the opposition will continue to speak for this disenfranchised group. And even as I accept this, I am clear that both administrations have been found wanted on this issue. Labour market reform. The opposition is happy that the long-awaited final report on labour market reform will be taken to Cabinet by June 30th. However, Mr. Speaker, let me remind my colleagues that the 5 critical pillars mandated for the Labour Market Reform Commission must form a critical part of the growth agenda. And these are critical, Mr. Speaker, speaking to productivity, speaking to innovation, to technology, speaking to industrial relations, social protection, and all of that. Mr. Speaker, this makes the tabling of this report in Parliament urgent and must be a priority of the government. Mr. Speaker, the PART program, 360 individuals on this program, 360,000 individuals on this program, approximately, of which 71% are children. Mr. Speaker, in spite of the announcement of increase of $3.8 billion during this financial year, $1.9 billion will go directly to PART beneficiaries and the remainder for the school feeding program. Program beneficiaries are seeing a reduction in the purchasing power of the stipend. Mr. Speaker, a crude mathematical calculation tells me that this increase will average approximately $5,500 per beneficiary for the entire year. This will work out to about a meager $450 per month or $112.50 per week for each beneficiary. Mr. Speaker, these persons are seeing the increase in bus fare, food price, electricity, clothing, and other such basic necessities. This is placing further pressure on these vulnerable citizens. Mr. Speaker, I want to suggest to the government that there be an upward revision of this figure so that it will enable PART beneficiaries to be more responsive to the shock brought on by these reckless tax measures. Mr. Speaker, last year I indicated to this Honourable House that PART does not have sufficient social workers to do the necessary case management of beneficiaries and to ensure compliance. I again will make that call. 200 social workers for the entire PART initiative, Mr. Speaker, can't work. This constitutes an average of 1,900 beneficiaries to one social worker. Oh my God. Can't work. And as it is now, 63,000 persons are beneficiaries or 20% of the beneficiaries are deemed non-compliant under the program. The National Insurance Scheme and the National Insurance Fund. Mr. Speaker, I wish to join the Minister in condemning those who would profit from the pensioners by scamming them. Mr. Speaker, these members of our society have given human service to cause and the country, and any attempt to rob them must be condemned. Mr. Speaker, the pensions and other benefits paid to the National Insurance Scheme, paid by the National Insurance Scheme, have to be examined with even greater urgency for increases in light of the price increases which have been adversely affecting this marginal group. Mr. Speaker, an NIS pensioner facing higher prices for the basket of basic goods and not having a corresponding increase in pension benefit must slide deeper into poverty, not prosperity. Mr. Speaker, in our presentation, the Minister indicated that the government will not grant any increase to the pensioners this year. Mr. Speaker, I regard this as a major travesty because the pensioners have been called upon to be among those who pay for this $1.5 million income tax compliant. Mr. Speaker, the almost $30 billion tax package has not spared the pensioners burdening them with rising cost of living, far outstripping their pension benefits. Mr. Speaker, even as this has happened, it is blatantly unjust for the Minister to glowingly announce to this Honourable House that the National Insurance Fund made a whopping $14 billion in investment income last year, but artlessly stated that there will be no increase for the pensioners.
It doesn't have a heart, man. No heart. No heart. Heartless.
Mr. Speaker, in the private sector, Mr. Speaker, in the private sector, no company could have made a large amount of profit and not even consider an interim dividend to its shareholders. The pensioners are the true shareholders of the NIF, and at least an interim dividend must be paid to them in light of the amount of money made from their investment. Mr. Speaker, it is for this very reason that the former Prime Minister, Portia Simpson, in the 1990s, invested $1.5 billion of the NIF fund, which today stands at $95 billion. And so we must do what we have to do. Mr. Speaker, with the 110 pensioners, 110,000 pensioners, if we were to look at $1,000 per month, it would be additional. It would be about $12,000 per pensioner per year. And all of this would just be about $1.3 billion. Mr. Speaker, we must continue to stand up for the pensioners, and as an opposition, we must continue to say that $14 billion, the most that has ever been achieved in any 1 year, the minister boasts. And at the same time, we are in that position. Mr. Speaker, senior citizens, I am happy, and the opposition very happy to be congratulating them for celebrating 40 years in relation to the council, the National Council for Senior Citizens, 40 years in terms of anniversary. And we continue to plead for more funding for them, Mr. Speaker. We want them to celebrate well during this year, and we want the country to continue to recognize them as a critical group contributing to national growth and development. The community of persons with disability. Mr. Speaker, there are more than 168,000 persons, Census 2001 report. And the World Bank is saying that in most countries,
Dr. Ferguson.
there's about 20%.
Dr. Ferguson.
Yes.
I thought you had only half a page, but you seem to have more. The Minister, the member's time for speaking has expired. You may wish to.
Mr. Speaker, I ask that the member's time be extended by 5 minutes to allow him to conclude his presentation.
The motion is that the member's time be extended by 5 minutes. Those in favour? Those against? The ayes have it. Dr. Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, colleagues. In relation to the community of persons with disabilities, Mr. Speaker, Jamaica continues to make stride, and I really want to pay tribute, Mr. Speaker, to Senator Floyd Morris, who has been a voice for this community and has done well in ensuring and continue to push for equity, whether it is the PART program or whether it is the council. He continues to put forward. We continue to ask the government to ensure that the Disabilities Act passed almost 3 years ago, that we begin with alacrity the real implementation of the elements of that act. This will allow for our disabled community to enjoy the rights and the dignity that this act allows for. Jamaica Council for Persons with Disability still strapped for cash. This year they put in a budget for $240 million, Mr. Speaker. They got only $95 million. This cannot be. Is this the government really serious about persons with disabilities? Does the government really care about these individuals? And this worries us, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are some recommendations we would want to make. There are 5 recommendations I will note. One, which is to revise the beneficiary identification system to make it more responsive to vulnerable groups such as persons with disability. To reverse the appeals committee, the appeals committee that have been established to hear appeals for unsuccessful PATH applicants. To provide our pensioners with a reasonable increase so that they can deal with the anticipated fallout from the horrendous tax increase. Mr. Speaker, it is evident that the minimum wage earners, security guards, the disabled, the NIS pensioners deserve increases. And the case has been made for interim or phased payments, something that the finance minister is accustomed to. Mr. Speaker, I've shown that the Joint Industrial Council, the Labour Market Reform Architecture, and the Occupational Safety and Health Act are integrals to the attainment of our 2030 National Development Goals. The process, however, requires inclusivity teamwork, openness, and transparency. Mr. Speaker, if any is too big to be ignored, none can be too small to be denied either. Mr. Speaker, in this enterprise called Jamaica Land We Love, none can be left behind. This is my commitment. This is our pledge. God bless you. God bless Jamaica.
Mr. Speaker, we thank the member from St. Thomas Eastern for his presentation, and we move to the third and final presentation coming from the other end of the island, the Member of Parliament from Westmoreland Eastern.
Mr. Luther Buchanan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am here today firstly because of the blessings of the Almighty God, who commanded me to a life of service to our country, Jamaica land we love. And I fervently pray for his continued mercy and vision. I want to use this opportunity to recognize and applaud the appointment of our maximum leader, the newly minted president of the People's National Party and the leader of the People's Loyal Opposition, Dr. Peter David Phillips. One who has an impressive intellect, integrity, compassion, innovativeness, fearlessness, commitment to Jamaica, and capacity for hard work. I am excited about working with him in his new capacity. I am in no fear. I am in no fear of successful contradiction when I proclaim that very soon he will continue to serve the people of Jamaica, but as Prime Minister of Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, in the same breath, I salute our former leader and Prime Minister, the Most Honourable Portia Simpson Miller, for her sterling and impressive service of leadership for over 40 years. I salute her sacrifices and remarkable journey to the highest office in our land. Mr. Speaker, she is a living embodiment that one is not limited by their circumstances of birth, but by their boundless imagination, integrity, and capacity to work and endure. I thank her, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunities I have been given to serve and for her unquestionable commitment to creating an environment that enables the Jamaican people to be the best they can. Mr. Speaker, most fulfilling is my experience garnered from working with and for the people of Eastern Westmoreland. Yes. My councillors, my constituency executive, cluster managers, youth leaders, women's groups, NGO, ministerial, fraternal, educators, all stakeholders for the progress and development of Eastern Westmoreland, a rural constituency. But, Mr. Speaker, I want also to recognize you and my colleagues on both sides of this house. Mr. Speaker. No, man, him not. Mr. Speaker, I want to make this contribution under your protection from some members across there. Because, Mr. Speaker, I made this contribution to the sectoral debate at a most relevant time. A time when the attention of the nation is focused on the crippling taxes that have been inflicted on the Jamaican people by that administration. At a time when the government is insisting that they have implemented their election promise of tax break. In fact, Mr. Speaker, that is only half the promise. The other half is that it would have cost taxpayers half of what it has turned out to be, and there would have been no new taxes. A time when the government has promised to seize people's land if their property taxes has not been paid. At a time when they have unleashed a cruel property tax package that will force the middle and working class to sell their land before the government take it from them. These are the issues we have to grapple with, and the environment in which I participate in this sectorial debate. Mr. Speaker, it is conduct like this which erodes confidence in our political system and give politicians a bad name and give Jamaicans a bad taste in their mouth. And no amount of glossy shoots, Facebook video, Instagram, Twitter posts can gloss over the fake news of the government of this day. Mr. Speaker, worrying is that the conduct of this administration is a model fashioned in a Jamaica that works only for a few. We on this side are committed to fashioning a Jamaica that works for all. Mr. Speaker, I wish to emphasize the themes of empowerment, mobilization, and transformation in my discussions of the rural development and housing sectors. These taken together will result in people power. Mr. Speaker, empowerment means having control over your life. Mobilization means acting on your purpose in life. Transformation means fundamentally changing your capabilities so that you are different and better. Mr. Speaker, rural development is a great source of people power and potentially the greatest game changer for our people. But governments must do more and find better ways of promoting people power over their land, titles of ownership, and housing for their families. They must do better to bring agriculture into the mainstream of modern industry and improve its value-added capacity. They must do better in bringing dignity to the life of the agricultural sector. And holistic expansion of rural towns must be central to rural development, including the housing sector. This, in brief, Mr. Speaker, is my belief. Mr. Speaker, today, May 2nd, is almost 4 years since Most Honourable Portia Simpson Miller announced on April 30, 2013, that a national task force to coordinate rural development would be launched. She did so in her budget presentation of that year. The task force was launched in 2014. It was tasked to look at drought mitigation, improving farm roads, community and ecotourism, establishing additional community access points, and increasing access to internet and related services, providing access to affordable housing solutions, delivering outstanding land titles and business development.
But you don't understand that.
Mr. Speaker, the purposes were for the purposes, Mr. Speaker, were for an integrated plan of rural development that would arrest the trend of rural to urban migration, which places pressure on urban centers. The main emphasis for rural development would be the building of townships, establishment of building enterprise, provision to access good health care systems and facilities, schools, water, roads, electricity, technology, and the creation of opportunities for economic advancement. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, the work of the task force was interrupted by the elections of February 2016. But, Mr. Speaker, this work will resume as an urgent complement to the leader of the opposition statement of future policy provided in his budget and subsequent presentations, including his inauguration address. Don't worry about it. His statement is a strong commitment to agricultural reform, land titling, and housing. It will also build on what has been recommended by the leader of the opposition recently, announced National Land Ownership Commission, which will assist Jamaicans in obtaining registered titles for their properties. I enthusiastically await the results of their work. Mr. Speaker, the Commission is to undertake a full review of the existing land titling system and land occupancy mechanisms, and to recommend strategies to give effect to a radical, cost-effective and timely land ownership program in Jamaica. This would create an ownership society whereby all Jamaicans can obtain registered titles to their properties. Too many Jamaicans remain outside of land ownership through no direct fault of their own. Mr. Speaker, we are committed to fashioning a Jamaica that works for all. Accordingly, just as we declared that in the words of a certain song, no bastard no day again, we will declare that no squatter no day again. Everyone laughing. This serious plight of squatting is a legacy of slavery to be eradicated. Former slaves were not compensated, and no framework was put in place to have them own the land on which they had worked. The leader of opposition, Mr. Speaker, also said the team would look at generational or family land and how to best resolve same within the National Land Titling Program, review agricultural and bauxite lands, and recommend strategies for rapid land ownership. Mr. Speaker, it is a fact that there are over 100 pieces of legislation that deal with land on the books, and the Commission must examine and make recommendations in this regard. It is, Mr. Speaker, in this regard that I raise an issue of major concern, which, without intervention, will not lead to a Jamaica that works for all. The opposition is pleased that the government has heeded the call to review the oppressive and unconscionable property tax regime which they had unleashed on the backs of the Jamaican people. The cruel increase in property taxes this time would have had devastating effects on the lives of ordinary Jamaicans, particularly the middle class, the poor, and the most vulnerable. We applaud the government for allowing the logic and good sense to prevail. However, we on this side remain deeply concerned, Mr. Speaker, about the prejudicial effect that the imposition of the new land valuation figures will have on the acquisition of land by countless Jamaicans. Under the Land Administration and Management Program, an initiative implemented by the People's National Party administration, all Jamaicans are able to apply for and obtain registered title to land at a fraction of the cost. Additionally, under the program, stamp duty and transfer tax are waived, thereby making the cost of obtaining land titles almost minimal. Mr. Speaker, in order to access land services, each applicant is required to pay a processing fee based on the unimproved value of the land as stated on the tax roll. Consequently, with the implementation of the new land values, the cost to access land services will definitely increase. Mr. Speaker, it is the view of the opposition that the acquisition of land, particularly by the poor, is an ideal that every government ought to support and fervently, actively encourage. Mr. Speaker, land ownership promotes social and economic growth and security. It ought never to be stymied by reckless and poorly timed government policies. We on this side are committed to fashioning a Jamaica that works for all people. The people's loyal opposition therefore call upon the government to review its decision to implement the new land values within the context of the Land Administration and Management Program. Specifically, we call upon the government to take active steps to ensure that ordinary Jamaicans are not prevented from obtaining the title on the land by reason of increased processing fees. Mr. Speaker, this is a good time to remind this House of the work started by the Rural Development Task Force, which I had the privilege of co-chairing as Minister of State and the minister that they reported to. I want to thank my co-chair, Mr. Carl Summon, and the other esteemed members of that task force. They included the heads of all critical agencies of government that signaled the importance placed on rural development. I also want to thank the members of Parliament on both sides who attended the seminars to place their ideas and the needs of their constituents on record. I am sure you will all give your continuing support. I ask that you trust my experience in this year. I was Minister of State, the Ministry of Agriculture. Mrs. Portia Simpson-Miller, immediate past president, entrusted me with the responsibility for rural development and housing as a spokesperson after the February elections. I am a rural MP from a larger rural parish and constituency. The clear majority of the members of this House are representatives of large rural constituents. Let us band together and give our fullest collective support to rural development. Mr. Speaker, just recently, an urban an urban development specialist at the Inter-American Bank and a Caribbean country development specialist produced a paper citing the expensiveness of housing in the Caribbean, and I will use some data from their studies. The cost of living and of building is high, building a house in Kingston is 3 times more expensive than in a typical Latin American city. Building adequate housing for Jamaica and 10 other Caribbean countries would cost about 18 billion US. More than 80% of the Caribbean population should be living in cities by the year 2050. But at 2010 data indicated that the percentage of annual median income needed to build a basic home was 17.8% in Kingston when compared to 6% in its comparable in Argentina, 3.9% when compared it's equal in Brazil, and 3.4% in Mexico City, Mexico. We must contain, if not reverse, the costs to our people by building more rural residents and rural land. But most troubling, Mr. Speaker, the proportion of urban population, the portion of urban population living in slums was the second highest in Jamaica at 60.5%, next only to Haiti at 74%. These are United Nations data for 2016. But, Mr. Speaker, there is hope. The CMIDB looked at a successful effort to tackle the lack of affordable housing across the region. Governments have launched programs to expand social housing, lower mortgages, lending costs, and promote disaster resistance buildings. The Dominican Republic is a case in point. In 1990, close to 30% of Dominicans lived in substandard housing. This portion has decreased to under 15% today. We too can achieve this if we empower, mobilize, and transform. In other words, if we exercise people power. Mr. Speaker, Senator Norman Grant says the Jamaican Agricultural Society believes there is an untapped rural economy that, if expanded, can play a critical role in Jamaica's economic transformation and can be the bedrock of Jamaica to gain economic independence. The rural economy is often thought of as synonymous with agriculture, but it is more than that and has been since the development of modern Jamaica since the 1950s. It is in the rural parishes that you find tourism, bauxite and mining, fishing and forestry, agro-parks, and a great source of remittance. It is there that you find the potential for an emergent cannabis industry, and you can read about it in the PNP manifesto of 2016. But, Mr. Speaker, rural poverty is still greater than urban poverty. The reason I believe is that the rural areas lose their wealth they create to urban parishes. Profits made by the banks and insurance companies and all the corporations named above either go overseas or to their headquarters in the capital city. However, this tends to happen all around the world. It is what the leader of opposition now called in his doctoral studies the center-periphery problem and the imbalances between development and underdevelopment. When the JAS talk about transformation, it means finding new systems to reinvest wealth in the rural economy and society. This includes housing. This new system must be based, I submit, on empowerment of farmers and rural citizens, mobilizing them towards that purpose and transforming their lives. I promise, Mr. Speaker, to be their agent of people power from this honorable House. Mr. Speaker, I agree with the IDB that despite progress made, much more needs to be done. There must be an affordable housing action plan and a doable rural development plan for Jamaica that would contain at least 3 elements. 1, new alliances between financial institutions, housing ministries.
Mr. Buchanan. Remember time for speaking.
No, something the clock malfunction, Speaker.
Hold on now, hold on.
Mr. Speaker.
Remember, we have to correct your time properly, so that's all.
Okay, Mr. Speaker. I will take the 15 minutes given by you.
Go ahead, member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I agree with the IDB that despite progress made, much more needs to be done. There must be an affordable housing action plan and a doable rural development plan for Jamaica that would contain at least 3 elements. New alliances between financial institutions, housing ministries, and the construction firms. A first generation of partnerships created many successful options for the middle class, but failed to find solutions for lower income residents. Government alone cannot fill the gap, I'm aware. Housing developers and governments must design attractive packages that reduce the cost of acquiring land and support the development of durable, low-cost building materials. The rent-to-own schemes like in Barbados, Trinidad, and Tobago are innovative approaches that should be explored. We need a new social contract with informal settlements in our cities. Neighborhood upgrading projects could revitalize slums with housing, public spaces, infrastructure, and schools in town development schemes, as the Rural Development Task Force felt then. But these programs will only succeed if they are done in close collaboration with residents and community-based organizations. 3, central and local governments must establish and enforce housing policies with explicit targets for affordable housing. It must be a national development priority that would revitalize distressed neighborhoods and limit sprawl. In 2016, United Nations member states committed to ensure access for all to adequate, safe, and affordable housing by 2030, as spelled out in the landmark Sustainable Development Goals. Mr. Speaker, to be more specific, the answer must be affordable housing, affordable land, and available titles. We have made a Herculean effort through the National Housing Trust, the National Housing Development Corporation, and Operation Pride in this regard. But we must take the politics out of land ownership, titling, and housing. We cannot tax property out of the reach of the people. We must also take the profiteering out of these as well. We cannot profiteer off land values. We must take the bureaucracy out of progress. We cannot frustrate people's application with time-consuming process. The political system, private sector, and state bureaucracy must be leading parts of what agricultural and rural transformation requires. Science and technology of building materials and building methods are also to be a part. Mr. Speaker, when we left office, we rolled the wicket for the new administration in low-income housing sector. We were in a position, I understand, that we were about to reduce, or we were at least considering reducing, the special contribution of Jamaica, 11.4 billion, that was being made by the National Housing Trust to the government of Jamaica. The then chairman of the trust said in November 2015, said that the NHT expected this contribution to become history by March 2017. The present administration, Mr. Speaker, loudly promised not to resort to this deduction. However, its election promises have made this impossible. How are Jamaicans to afford housing mortgages under the increased cost of living, including property taxes? They face even with the best of efforts of the NHD. How will the NHD build low-cost housing under these increased costs? How will the government reduce the special contributions after its promise of big giveaways during an election campaign? How will it continue to place the first step housing and inner city housing? Mr. Speaker, how will the NHD be able to afford and permit increases in loan limits as it has done in the recent past to help low-income population? We must keep the momentum of the NHD collaboration with Food for the Poor and then the Jamaica Emergency Employment Program, JEEP. Can the people not recall the first step homes in Hamden, Trelawney, or the inner city housing projects and service lots provided in Nashville, St. Mary, and in Westmoreland, or in Perth, Manchester, or Longville in Clarendon, or Hellshire in St. Catherine? I recall, Mr. Speaker, that in 2015, NHD was considering utilizing $2 billion of its capital budget for sanitization and the building of homes for the elderly and the sickly to prevent its developments from falling into ruin. The plan would require an amendment to the NHD Act. And this is an idea that we will encourage and consider again. We must repair the housing infrastructure. We cannot allow housing to become slums as had happened in the past. Mr. Speaker, I have in the past pledged my support and is today for the pre-disaster prevention unit of the Ministry of Agriculture. It is still a new unit established only in 2015. We must arrest and charge more thieves who steal property, butcher without license, and sell unsuspecting meat. I also commend the unit's training.
Minister, the members' time.
Mr. Speaker, the members' time for speaking expired. I ask that it be extended the next 5 minutes to conclude the speech.
Plus the 2 with it.
Order, please. The order is that the motion that the members' time be extended by 5 minutes. Those in favour? Those against? Mr. Buchanan, you may proceed for another 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I commend the unit's training of the resident magistrates and clerks of court to reinforce just how serious the criminal offences of breeder larceny and farm theft are. But, Mr. Speaker, we need more police, vehicles, and technology on the ground. Mr. Speaker, I just want to touch on one relating matter quickly. Policing for national security, which engenders positive thinking and productivity. Yeah, man. Mr. Speaker, when you think about seeking to achieve productivity and efficiency, a critical component of any such plan must look at the environment in which we are operating as it pertains to national security. We have operated this way for almost since the inception of the JCF, whilst crime escalates. Mr. Speaker, I have before, others have now, posited the view of us restructuring the modus operandi of the JCF. I believe time has come for us to divide the police hierarchical responsibilities by county. We should have Cornwall, Middlesex, and Surrey operating on their own budgets, reporting to their own heads. Mr. Speaker, without empirical data at hand, common sense will tell you that each county demands different resources. And so instead of an overkill, costly decision on what is necessary for the job, it would be specific to county. Further to that, Mr. Speaker, monitoring and tracking of vehicles would be easier if vehicles were to be tied into the system by county color-coded plates, parish-specific initials, and mandatory reporting and alignment of changes in address within the system no longer than 6 weeks after. Just imagine, Mr. Speaker, the impact this would have on criminal activities, for example, car cloning and parade and larceny. Mr. Speaker, I hereby, in closing, call on the Prime Minister and the Cabinet to enter upon the reference of immediate implementation of this proposal in order that we may achieve the kind of public confidence necessary to achieve unprecedented levels of productivity and security. Mr. Speaker, we believe in rural development because we are committed to a Jamaica that works for all. We want to expand land ownership. We want to expand housing opportunities because we are committed to a Jamaica that works for all. We believe importantly in eliminating tribalism and vulgar partisanship from our governance process because we are committed to a Jamaica that works for all. We reject, Mr. Speaker, we reject fake news and false social media posts because we are committed to a Jamaica that works for all. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we believe in honest campaigns and honest governance because we are committed to a Jamaica that works for all. Mr. Speaker, I understand our plight because some of these policies of the current administrations were conceived with a lie, born with a lie, and are being implemented with a lie. I pray for Jamaica land.
Conceived in sin.
Mr. Speaker.
Members may have some order, please.
Mr. Speaker, while I could have interrupted the member during his speech, I did not do so, but I wish now to rise on a point of order to correct a misstatement made by the member regarding plans that he has suggested to forfeit and sell properties for outstanding property taxes. I wish to remind this Honourable House that the amending bill to the Tax Collection Act was first tabled by the former administration. I have already publicly declared my intention to revisit that policy which we inherited from the previous government. And Mr. Speaker, I have already publicly stated that the government does not intend to seize people's property.
Order, please.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I ask that the sectoral debate be suspended until tomorrow.
Okay, you need to okay, you reject it.
Members, please. The motion is that the debate be suspended until tomorrow. Those in favour? Those against? As of it. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for recommittal of the item. Notice of motion given orally. I ask for commitment of announcement. You don't hear what I say. Go buy your hearing aids. You're only good for KMPs.
Members of the House of Representatives. Members of the House of Representatives. The Minister is asking that the item announcement be recommitted. Those in and the notice of motion. Those in favour? Those against? As of it. Minister. Mr. Announce. Order, please. Announcements.
Also laid on the table of the House today are the following: the Provisional Collection of Tax General Consumption Tax Order 2017 and the Provisional Collection of Tax General Consumption Tax Order Confirmation, Modification and Extension Resolution 2017.
Notice of motion given orally. Mr. Shaw.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move, whereas by virtue of Section 3, subsection 1 of the Provisional Collection of Tax Act, hereinafter referred to as the Act, the Minister may, by order published in the Gazette, provide for the variation, renewal, or imposition of any tax. And whereas by virtue of Section 3(1) of the Act, the Minister made the Provisional Collection of Tax General Consumption Tax Order 2017, which was published on the 10th day of March 2017 in the Jamaica Gazette Supplement, Proclamation, Rules and Regulations, hereinafter referred to as the Gazette, as Legal Notice 14. And whereas Section 3, subsection 3 of the Act provides that an order made under that subsection, subject to its confirmation with or without modification by resolution of the House of Representatives within 30 days on which the House sits after the date of publication of the order in the Gazette, shall continue for a period of 6 months, hereinafter referred to as the initial period, next following publication thereof in the Gleaner, in the Gazette. Additional period of 3 months commencing immediately after the expiration of the initial period.
Mr. Speaker, is not intended to do any further business today. I move that the House be adjourned until tomorrow, 2 o'clock.
The motion is that the House be now adjourned until tomorrow at 2 p.m. Those in favour? Those against? As of it. This Honourable House now stands adjourned.
Current Affairs. Business.